All right, welcome everyone. I call the September 20, 2023 Planning Commission meeting to order.
Echo.
We have a little feedback. I'm going to pause. All right. Okay, it seems to have gone away. All right, minor technical glitch, but we're going. The main purpose of tonight's meeting is a study session on the 2024 Imagine Bothell Comprehensive Plan Land Use, Housing, and Economic Development section. Before we move on to the agenda items, I'd like to acknowledge our hybrid meeting format. The City of Bothell is providing an option to attend this meeting either in person or remotely via Zoom. For those participating via Zoom, the chat and question functions are not available to ensure compliance with the Open Public Meetings Act. We have a public comment agenda item at the beginning of the meeting. This time is for comments on issues not on tonight's agenda. Excuse me. Please limit these comments to 3 minutes. Please note that the City of Bothell does not tolerate verbal harassment. Please remember this during your comments. Public comment and hearing testimony will be allowed, though there is not a hearing tonight, both in person and via Zoom. Those wishing to comment via Zoom were asked to submit an online form by 3 p.m. today. People wishing to submit written comments were also encouraged as well and will be acknowledged. Those in attendance may also make comments and have been asked to indicate their desire to comment on the sign-in sheets at the door. The Imagine Bothell notice, city website, and tonight's agenda all provided information to the public for providing comments. The video of the meeting will be streamed live as well as recorded and available for later viewing on the city's YouTube channel. A call-in number was provided on the meeting agenda for members of the public who wish to call in by phone and listen live to the meeting. For our phone-in callers, during staff presentations, staff will make every effort to specify which meetings they are referencing so that everyone can follow along. At this point, we'll take a moment to acknowledge the attendance of the commissioners. Commissioner Jones.
Here.
Commissioner Westerbeck.
Here.
Commissioner Curd is absent and excused. Commissioner Robson.
Here.
Yes, via Zoom. Commissioner Anders.
Here.
And Commissioner Gustafson.
Here.
In addition, I'd like to acknowledge the staff who are here. Jason Greenspan, Community Development Department Director, Senior Planner Kirsten Mann, and Community Engagement Specialist Sarah Frost are attending. And we'll introduce consultants at presentation time. Okay. Lastly, before we begin, I'd like to reiterate some meeting guidelines. For all meeting attendees, please speak clearly and pause frequently. State your name each time before speaking. Mute your microphone when not speaking. If you are also streaming the live video feed, please turn the sound off as there is a delay. Before we begin, I would like to remind the commenters that while you may speak to whatever topic you choose, we ask that if you are a council candidate, you do not use this time to speak to your own campaign. Each person is solely responsible for their comments, but speaking about your campaign could be a violation of campaign finance laws, which the Public Disclosure Commission would determine. For commissioners, at specific breaks in the presentation, I'll be calling on members who wish to speak or ask a question. If you want to speak, please indicate this by raising your hand, and I will call on you as I see you. This will help avoid the problem of having two people speak at the same time. Identify yourself before you ask a question, make a motion or second a motion, or participate in debate. Please mute your microphone when not speaking. The first item on the agenda is public comment. The city has accepted visitor comment in writing as well as accepted sign-up sheets for those who wish to speak at tonight's meeting. Those speaking will have 3 minutes. Written comments submitted to staff no later than 3 p.m. today were forwarded to all commissioners and are part of the record, and we did receive 10 comments today. This time is for items not on tonight's agenda. And at the last meeting, there was a question raised about the 3-minute time limit for speakers. While the Commission's bylaws are silent on this matter, we rely on the Bothell City Council's protocols. Chapter 8.07, paragraph I states, speakers will limit their remarks to 3 minutes unless a longer period is permitted by council. No speaker may convey or donate his or her time for speaking to another speaker. So, 3 minutes, please. Are there any, so moving on, do we have any indicated public comments? Anyone wish to speak? Please step up and turn on the microphone. You'll have 3 minutes.
I'm speaking to the West Hill sub-area specifically tonight. West Hill, the east side of it, drains into Swamp Creek, which is a salmon spawning stream. The west side of West Hill drains into, as you know, Horse Creek. Those are both two drainage subbasins for the overall sub-basin, not sub-basin, but drainage basin to the Sammamish River. Now, it may not be evidently apparent to those who aren't interested in geology, but a long time ago, Bothell's West Hill and Norway Hill were all a part of the same flood drumlin. That's the official term. They have the same stratigraphy underneath, I believe. But in reviewing Central Washington University geologist Zentner, Professor Zentner, what it appears happened a long time ago is there's a giant lake here, and West Hill and Norway Hill were all the same. And the lake broke through. Where did it break through? Right along the 522 highway route. And it cut this gap. So Norway Hill is currently zoned RC. West Hill, you're proposing in your option 1 to zone it residential medium density, when the geology tells us they are the same. And if you just examine the map, you'll see that we are a more important residential conservation area than Norway Hill, as evidenced by the creeks. So please don't revise the 2015 Comprehensive Plan West Hill sub-area at all. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Any other members of the audience wish to comment? Yes, please step forward. And you'll have 3 minutes once you start.
Good evening. Ann A. Guard, 16524 104th Avenue Northeast. Both GMA and Bothell's current Imagine Bothell comprehensive plan under housing elements includes language that ensures that the vitality and character of established residential neighborhoods. To implement these requirements, both of GMA and what is in our current plan, additional alternatives, information, and language must be added to the alternatives referenced in this evening's agenda packet. First, alternative 1, attachment 1, the no action is not a valid alternative and will not meet SEPA requirements. HB 1110, the middle housing, requires that the city implement some middle housing, whether it's 2 dwelling units per acre, 4 units if one is affordable, 4 units if it's 1/4 walkable mile from transit. They must also implement a climate change element. So alternative 1 does not do this. I request that an additional alternative 4 be added that addresses the 110 and 1181. The proposed land use maps, attachments 1 and 2, do not include a definition of what residential medium zoning would comprise, and does not include a definition of what residential low land use would comprise. Clearly, this document needs to identify the types of land uses and include detailed rules and processes for how it relates to the implementing zones. There are also references made to small-scale multifamily in the RM areas and the RL areas, and to increase densities when, quote, transit structures are added. Information on how these will be implemented should be available now. Finally, Bothell's permitted trends under the growth targets states that the trends over the last 12 years have accommodated more structures in the low-income bands. The capacity that the city will need to meet housing targets across all income ranges.
Your 3 minutes are up, please wrap.
Thank you, I'm completing my sentence.
Okay.
Is not yet clear. So please look at other alternatives. And here's a copy of my statement.
Thank you for your
Should I give
comments.
to the,
Yes.
okay, hi, Sarah. Got it. I also sent this in today for the record.
Any other individuals in the audience wish to speak? Seeing none, do we have anyone in Zoom who wishes to speak?
If any of the attendees,
Whoa, that's a problematic mic.
Hey, here we go. If any of the attendees on Zoom wish to speak, please raise your hand and you'll be permitted your 3 minutes.
All right, seeing none, that will end the public comment period. Thank you for those who did make comments. They will be part of the record moving forward. Our next agenda item is the approval of the July 19th minutes. Is there a motion to approve those minutes? Commissioner Westerbeck.
Commissioner Westerbeck carries. I move to approve the minutes as written.
Is there a second?
Sarah Gustafson here, I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded that we approve the July 19th minutes. Any discussion around those minutes? Y'all a minute and look at our commissioners. Seeing no indication, all in favor of approval of the July 19th minutes, please indicate by saying aye.
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 And I believe we have unanimous consent on that, so the July 19th minutes are approved. That brings us to the principal item on tonight's agenda. It is the 2024 Imagine Bothell Comprehensive Plan Periodic Update, Land Use, Housing, and Economic Development. And Senior Planner Mann, I believe you'll lead us on this one.
Yes, thank you, Chair Kiernan. So as Chair Kiernan mentioned, we're going to be talking tonight about land use, housing, and economic development, a primary component of that being the growth targets. And I also want to introduce Jessie Hartman. She's a Senior Associate Planner at Burke Consulting, who is working with us on the project.
Welcome.
So first off, just again, a reminder of the timeline. We're inching towards the end of the third quarter of this year. So the next quarter is going to be really getting into the meat and potatoes of goals and policies and working on actual development of the plan components. We are still in scoping. The scoping comment period is running through the 27th. We have some ongoing engagement that I'll be talking about a little bit more on one of the next slides. And that's sort of how we're going to be wrapping up the year. The beginning of the year, We are hoping to have public drafts of the element by the end of February, and that is what you can kind of expect moving forward. So upcoming engagement, the next big one is our comp plan open house for a day or a lifetime tour. I'll just be reiterating that as much as I can, just to make sure we can get as much folks to come as possible. Again, it's going to be at Skyview Middle School in the Commons from 5 to 8:30. You can come and go as you please. It'll be open for whenever you'd like to be there. We'll have childcare available. I think there's going to be some food opportunities as well, some games for kids. So if you have kids and you want to come, don't feel like you have to leave them at home or get a nanny or anything. We're also going to be doing some tabling at the Trick or Treat on Main Street. This is really just going to be us being available to provide information and answer questions, just have a presence. And we're also going to be continuing to participate at the Civic Saturday sessions at the King County Library in downtown Bothell. On the 18th of November, it will be a Civic Spaces session. I do want to reiterate, we are not the entirety of these events. We're going to be there kind of for the last 10 minutes to give a little presentation and then stay for Q&A, just be available for folks to talk to. So if you want to come just towards the end and talk to us, that's great. We also encourage you to come for the whole session. They're really great, informative sessions on civics. And then in January on the 20th, it's going to be a civic infrastructure session. And then, as I mentioned, because we're looking to have public drafts available at the end of February, we're planning on our second open house in March of 2024, and that's going to be more specific to the actual draft plan itself. And then upcoming meeting dates for Planning Commission and Council, just want to continue to let people know what's upcoming. Obviously, tonight is the 20th, and we're talking about land use, housing, and economic development. Next session is going to be on October 4th. We'll be discussing climate. We're hoping to have a second revision of the draft climate element to provide, talking a bit about the natural environment, shoreline, and parks. The 17th, we'll be doing land use, housing, and economic development, again with council. And then getting into talking about sub-areas, cultural resources, and urban design at the 1st of November Planning Commission meeting. 14th of November, again, talking about climate, natural environment, shoreline, and parks, this time with council. And then there'll be a transportation session the following night on the 15th. Coming back to council to talk about sub-areas, cultural resources, and urban design on the 21st of November. We tentatively have scheduled a council session on transportation on December 5th, but that is not 100% confirmed. And then rounding out the rest of the year, coming back to Planning Commission on the 6th to talk about capital facilities, human services, and utilities. And then we'll also do a presentation on how the open house went, and then having that same session with council on the 12th. So an overview of tonight's session, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of our past housing trends based on the data we get from the Office of Financial Management on our permitting. Talking a bit about how OFM does their projections, their sort of methodology for that for the state. And again, that's the Office of Financial Management. They're the ones that do the statewide targets. And then a little bit about GMA compliance and sort of the importance of that for the city. Talking a bit about existing conditions and some of the potential changes to the economic development element we've been discussing both with our consultant team as well as our economic development manager, Jeannie Ash. Talking a little bit, just reiterating what we've talked about so far when it comes to land use methodology, just to remind everyone of the discussions we've already have. Jesse's going to spend some time talking us through the land use map alternatives, and then I'll wrap it up with sort of next steps on this topic and then upcoming sort of schedule stuff as well. So again, no specific action tonight. We're really just looking for feedback on the land use alternatives. I do want to reiterate, these are kind of early drafts. We don't have a lot of specifics yet. We're just getting in that kind of policy level discussion of how we want to think about where growth should go. So past housing trends and growth targets. So this is showing structures permitted versus housing units permitted over the last 12 years, so from 2011 to 2023. And as you can see, we've permitted a lot of single-family structures, but in terms of the actual units being permitted, those are mostly being captured in larger structures. So 5 units or more, which typically are your larger apartment buildings. And then growth targets. So OFM uses a few different things to project growth, one being the birth rate, the mortality rate, and the net migration in the state. Those targets are assigned for a 20-year planning window, and then they look at creating methodology for assigning that within the county. And that comes down to OFM providing targets for the counties. They get a range. There's a low, medium, and a high target. Most counties pick the medium target just because that seems to be the most realistic. And then the counties work within themselves with local jurisdictions to figure out the best way to assign those targets to their lists of cities and towns. Those are put into groupings. We are a core city. The next grouping above us are metropolitan cities. And then they go down from there just based on population size. A couple of different factors go into those assignings of targets, things like past trends, overall size, transit stops. So they try to make it fair in terms of who's getting how much growth within the county using some data points. And then HB 1220, this kind of threw a wrench in a lot of the work we were doing with the targets. We'd been assigned an overall target for population growth. HB 1220 is what is creating us to go do what's called a housing need assessment. So basically, based on our target and the existing kind of mix of affordable housing, how much do we need to provide at different levels of affordability? I know this chart is a little confusing, it's a little wonky, but basically this guidance is telling us how do we show Department of Commerce that we're meeting our growth targets? And knowing the fact that this wasn't a funded piece of legislation, so we as a city can't take money and go build affordable housing, how do we get to our targets? And what Department of Commerce has said is, well, we know that certain types of housing structures tend to be more or less feasible for providing affordable housing in terms of qualifying for subsidies or incentives. And those tend to be your low-rise to mid-rise multifamily structures. Low-rise being your walk-up apartments, 2 to 3 floor condos. Mid-rise, in my mind, tends to be like your 5/1s, like we see a lot of in downtown, that don't trigger a different building type that can increase the cost of that structure. And so that's what kind of makes it easier for those to be counted as something that could potentially be subsidized. So for us, that means looking at, okay, so when we look at a zone category and the type of housing that could be permitted there, we see there's a column for, with no subsidies or incentives, what would we generally assume the cost of that housing to be based on area median income? And for the most part, most of those are going to be higher to moderate. For the ones that can reasonably be made more affordable through subsidies and incentives, what's the level of affordability we think we can get those to? This is an example guidance, so we are going to have to do, as part of our housing needs assessment, show Department of Commerce, based on our analysis, what we think is realistic. But this is their guidance chart from communities with higher cost housing, which we consider ourselves, unfortunately, to be one of those. So for those low-rise and mid-rise multifamily types, per their guidance, with subsidies and incentives, it's potentially able to get it at that 0 to 80% of AMI level. The other ones being moderate for high-rise tower and ADUs, and then higher income for low-density and moderate-density housing. So I know that's a lot of very specific information, but this is just giving a sense of what we're needing to think about when we're figuring out how to meet our targets. And it really kind of gets down to housing type more than anything. This is a very simple chart, thankfully, compared to the housing one, job targets. These just are what our job targets are. I know we're at a deficit in both counties, so that's something we also have to think about when we're looking at our land use designations, and then as well when we're looking at our zoning map and zoning regulations as well. These are housing unit targets. We finally got confirmed targets from King County. The GMPC voted on these. As you can see, we do have quite a large number in those lower AMI in sections. And this is what we're working with at this point. I do want to note the emergency housing requirements don't count towards the total units. That's kind of its own sort of separate beast. Jesse can probably speak to this a little bit more, but my understanding from reading the guidance is that's mostly about making sure we're not precluding the ability for emergency housing to be built within the city. And so that's just making sure we have regulations that don't preclude it. So what are some of the takeaways that we can think about from our past trends? So as I noted, past permitting trends over the 12 years have been predominantly single family, but those have been contributing significantly fewer total housing units. And based on the Department of Commerce guidance, we know that those aren't contributing to those lower AMI bands. So it's likely that because of these past trends, that's kind of contributed to why our growth targets for housing needs tend to skew towards some of those lower bands. And also we've noticed that through those charts, there aren't a lot of units in that sort of mid-range housing level from your duplexes up to fourplexes. So this is just a little bit of information trying to figure out, what happens if we're not compliant. There is the possibility of sanctions, including monetary sanctions. That's one component of it. I spent some time talking to our finance department just to get an idea of what that really means and what some of those funding sources could mean for all of the budget that we have. So based on the list of potential sanctions in state law, our finance department let me know that represented about 30% of our general fund and about 15% each of our capital improvement fund and our street fund. A couple of the other things that would potentially happen wouldn't be able to apply for any state grant funding, and the majority of our permit applications wouldn't be able to vest. The only things you could really take in permits for are boundary line adjustments and some remodeling and building single-family homes by use of the owner and being built by the owner, so kind of limited. And then shifting gears just a little bit before we get into the land use maps, I wanted to speak a little bit about economic development since it's very much related to land use and housing. I tried to group the topics together for our sessions in a way that kind of makes sense and how they sort of work together. Wanted to talk a little bit about some employment trends. These graphics were put together by the Burke staff. We have some more too, but these were the ones I felt made a lot of sense to talk about tonight. So we have seen some good job growth. I was able to find the comparative average growth for King County, but not Snohomish County. And I think it was 1.8% in King County, so we're a little bit above where the county overall, at least in King, is at. We've continued to see continued steady growth, as I mentioned. Our sectors are actually fairly well balanced when looking at adjacent jurisdictions, and they've become even a bit more balanced since 2012. And I have a chart here showing that. You can see within some of our nearby jurisdictions, we do have a really good mix of different types of employment sectors. I think Woodinville is the only one that has a bit more on the construction side. So we're doing pretty well, and that's consistent with what I've heard from our economic development manager. We particularly have a really strong manufacturing sector that has seen us pretty well through the COVID period as well. And then some areas of focus in terms of when we're thinking about updates to the goals and policies of the economic development plan. The chart on the left, or the picture on the left, that's from our current plan. That's showing different centers we have in the city, both our regional growth center, we have what we call neighborhood and activity centers. A lot of those have kind of loose definitions in the current plan, and feedback we've gotten from both Planning Commission and Council is trying to take a more neighborhood scale approach when it comes to different mixes of uses. So we're kind of thinking about, well, this might be a great existing map to kind of leverage and build off of when we're thinking about neighborhood centers. We're also paying really close attention to the requirements for our candidate countywide growth centers. We have two. One is downtown, and the other one is the north half of Country Village, just the Snohomish County portion. So we want to make sure that we can meet those minimum requirements to become countywide growth centers. That is a new designation. We're making sure we're reflecting some of the best practices that we took out of Urban 3. Looking at our new employment targets, of course, we want to make sure we can meet those so we can be compliant. Part of this is also our implementation plan, so making sure we can make it functional and we're doing what we set out to do. A component of that is the economic vitality plan that came out of the council vision. So we are working closely again with our economic development manager, Jeannie Ash, who's working on that project, both to make sure that it's consistent with the element, but also to make sure we're not duplicating efforts when it comes to the analysis and data work that we're doing. We also want to make sure we're integrating climate change and equity in all areas of the plan, including economic development. And one other topic that has come up is potential changes to home occupation regulations. We do have a lot of home occupations in the city, and we've had interest for home occupations that wouldn't currently be permitted. So that is another topic we're starting to kind of think through and see if maybe there's some ways we could look at that once we get to the regulatory component of the work. And then the last section before we get into the maps is just a reiteration of some of the best practice we've talked about and the big moves we've been discussing as well. So again, this is not a new slide for you all. Talking about reflecting HB 1110 and 1337 in terms of a transition away from single family, acknowledging that change in legislation and integrating that into the plan, as well as our targets, making sure that sustainable infrastructure and land use is taken into account. We're meeting our future development needs. We're thinking about the costs and impacts and minimization of those and climate resilience, streamlining the process and the land use map, and creating more of a logical relationship between the land use and the zoning, so everything kind of flows together well and it makes sense as two pieces that work together. Again, looking at our centers and sub areas, making sure we're taking into account equity and quality of life through the improvement of amenity resources and considering the full range of different community needs. And then environmental quality, that's going to be a component of every different part of the plan. This is some of the feedback that we got at our last session talking about land use. There was a discussion about making sure we were emphasizing pluralism in the map and how we look at the edges and how we relate to adjacent jurisdictions within the region. Making sure we're including all public facilities. We went back through with a fine-tooth comb and made sure we got all the facilities on there, all the schools. Again, an emphasis on equity and transitions, including streets on the map in order to make sure you can figure out where you are within it, and we did add that in. Partnering with transit, we've been continuing discussions with our transit agencies. We have a transit agency focus group we're working with and making sure that we're understanding their future needs, where they're putting future infrastructure. We should have some transit representation at the forum as well, so there'll be an opportunity to at least talk to community transit that's working on the Swift Line extension and then a couple of changes to services that will be going through the center of the city. And then in general, ensuring clarity, readability, and some of that is still ongoing while we're trying to refine the land uses and develop the processes. So that is some ongoing work as well. And then again, just to reiterate, because some of this is a little bit new for us, having a land use map that is really separate from the zoning map, just reiterating that it is a big picture plan. It's looking forward to the future. It's called a future land use map because it's sort of us looking to that 20-year period of where things might shift. It's using color, and that's to help us get a sense of where are the different types of uses and the intensities of uses, and it provides that policy direction for the regulations and depicting clear relationships to the zones. And then zoning being a regulatory framework that we use to evaluate projects when they come in for review. It specifies uses being permitted or not, and then the rules on how a permitted use could be developed. And in the graphic, I'm just showing the existing conditions or no action land use map draft against our current zoning map. And then this is a section of the crosswalk between the land uses and the corresponding zones. We have a lot of zones just because of the way our zoning works. We have a list of zones, and then we have combinations of zones that create new zones. So these were the ones with the shortest lists that I could fit on a slide. So for the residential conservation zone, we have both of the R40,000 designations, one being just generally R40,000, and then one that also has low impact development in the North Creek protection area included. So this just gives you an idea of the density levels within each of those designations. And with that, I'm going to pass things on over to Jessie to help us with. Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, I haven't used one of these microphones before. So Jessie Hartman, I'm with Brick Consulting, and as Kirsten mentioned, I'm kind of the consultant PM side for this. I'm here to talk to you about the future land use alternatives that we are kind of beginning to develop to look at as we work on the plan update. So part of the comprehensive plan update is that we will do an environmental impact statement consistent with the SEPA requirements. And in that we look at least usually 3 alternatives for how, reasonable alternatives for how growth may occur in the city of Bothell. So they need to represent a range of reasonable options for achieving the comp plan objectives, and the no action alternative is required under SEPA to be the benchmark for comparison with the kind of action alternatives. It assumes no policy or land use changes beyond separating the future land use map and the zoning map. And like Kirsten was mentioning, the land use designations have kind of a corresponding set of implementing zones within each of the designations. So we've aggregated some land use designations on this future land use map under the no action that are consistent with those existing underlying zones. And then we've also clearly designated the parks and public uses on here. But because there are no policy or land use changes otherwise, it means the no action doesn't comply with any of the new requirements around middle housing, housing capacity for all the income levels, ADUs, or planning for climate change. It also assumes the city will grow consistent with the growth targets, but only up to available buildable land capacity. So as part of this process, we reconciled the buildable lands analysis that King County and Snohomish County had done for Bothell in 2021. They use kind of different methodologies, and so we got ourselves to a place where the methodology was consistent, and we updated it with some of the newer assessor information from the latter half of 2022 and early 2023, recognizing that is still not a perfect representation of what is on the ground today. We're always going to be a little bit behind when you're looking at capacity, but getting ourselves a little closer to what the actual conditions are. And so based on that revised buildable lands, there's enough capacity overall for housing, but not at those lower income bands, 80% and less of area median income. And then there isn't enough job capacity in either county, with the biggest deficit in Snohomish County, and that is very similar to what the King County and Snohomish County buildable lands work also showed us. And then if we want to go to the other one, so the action alternatives both use the same future land use map, but they aim to meet kind of housing targets by income band and then the increased employment opportunities in two different ways. So the underlying zoning would have varying regulations to vary the type, pattern, and density of growth to meet those targets. So both of these assume some, again, the growth consistent with the targets, but now we would be increasing capacity so that you could actually meet those targets. And they would both redesignate some targeted areas from residential low to medium. And that's kind of where additional services are currently available or planned to be available. You can see some of that in the center of the map here, where it's gone from the kind of the yellow to the orange. It's also west of downtown and kind of west of Red Barn. And a lot of that is aligned with where more transit is expected to be in the future. And then under either of the action alternatives, so this one we're looking at here and then the next slide as well, the residential densities would increase across the city with the new middle housing from HB 1110 and the ADUs in HB 1337. So you would see some density increases everywhere. The difference being that in this neighborhoods-based alternative, the additional housing capacity you need to create for, especially across the income bands, would be spread more through the residential areas by allowing more housing types and increasing the density a bit in those areas. So you'd see some smaller scale multifamily in the residential medium. The residential low would mostly see the density increases as a result of HB 1110. And so essentially you would see more growth with middle housing and infill in the kind of orange and yellow areas. And then in the centers alternative, which is the next slide, again, same map, but instead of, and it would still be doing the assuming growth consistent with the targets, redesignating those targeted areas from low to medium, and seeing that slight increase in density, but the additional housing capacity would be focused in your centers and corridors with some increased height and FAR allowances. So that would mean that you'd essentially see taller and denser kind of multifamily and mixed use buildings in the existing mixed use areas. So downtown, Canyon Park, North Creek, and Red Barn, which are essentially, you'd see it in the purple and downtown kind of portions of this map. And now we're hoping to open it up to discussion. Yeah.
Yes, so that is the end of the presentation component of tonight. So we're here to just chat through this. Again, this is sort of the higher level view of that. We have these two potential methodologies. It could be that we end up with a mix of both. It could be really like one or the other. And then at that point, once we're kind of get a sense of what direction to go, that's when we can start taking a look at the regulatory component and the zones themselves to see, all right, what would that mean for the zoning map itself now that we have an idea of where we want to go policy-wise. So I will open it up for discussion.
So I'm going to hear from the commissioners first before I look to the audience. Commissioners, questions, comments?
Sarah Gustafson here. First of all, I am currently supporting the neighborhoods alternative. I did have a question about something previously mentioned. What is the consequence, if any, of not providing the target amount of low-income units, given that there's acknowledgement that these are pretty much impossible without subsidy?
Do you mean the actual provision of the units ultimately?
Let me see. That's a good question. My understanding is that there's a target of low-income units that need to be built.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not quite sure what the timeline is on this, but in the same instance where we're talking about HB 1220 requiring these to be built at some time or another, they're also acknowledging in their presentation and their guidance that it is really hard to build these without subsidy. So does Bothell get a pass on not building these? What does Bothell have to do in order to show that it's trying to meet this?
I think, and you can quote me if I'm wrong, I think as of now, the goal is we have to show that we have the capacity for it.
Okay.
But in terms of actually building it, I'm not sure if we have direction.
No, I don't think the city is responsible for actually building the units. You are responsible for showing you have capacity to accommodate those units within the zones that you have. Another piece of that is often we are, and we've been given the okay on this, to kind of look at the 0 to 80% AMI as a group and provide capacity for units that meet all of those, that kind of combined need. Because the recognition is that a lot of the lower income ones require subsidies, it's very hard to show that you have capacity specifically for only 0 to 30. So you're really looking at the kind of lower income bands as a group. And then part of it is just removing the barriers to allow usually, blanking on the term, but usually other kind of housing providers to come in and build those units.
I'll just add one other piece of information. The GMA was amended in 2022 to require all cities to report on implementation at a 5-year period.
Okay.
So it would not surprise me at all at that 5-year point if there isn't significant progress being made amongst all cities that have to address this requirement. There would be potentially a reckoning at the state level and some resources potentially identified, but I think that 5-year check-in is going to be really essential.
Okay, thank you for this information. This provides a lot of good background. And I think I see the answer. I think my point is that even if we build those multifamily, we're still not meeting, or even if we provide the capacity for the multifamily, we're still not meeting the goal because it's shown in the presentation that multifamily even is not going to meet the under 80%. It's still in the 80 to 120%. So even if Bothell does this and provides capacity, are we still falling short?
That's where some of the other kind of lower rise multifamily comes in instead of just the larger units. There are more housing types to meet those needs, and that's part of our next step is matching up which unit or which types of housing based on the Commerce guidance would meet those needs, and then what zones would allow those types of units to be built. Mm-hmm.
Other commissioners? Commissioner Jones.
Commissioner Jones, thank you so much for the presentation. I I always like when we show alternatives to have a really as complete a listing of pros and cons, benefits and costs, sort of, in terms of that. Because it really helps us see what we're no one alternative is going to be perfect, right? So we're going to gain some things, we're going to lose some things, and then it comes down to values. And so when I think about alternative number 2 in the neighborhoods, the question I'm wondering, and I think I'm reading this, but I want to confirm, is that alternative 2 might lead to more home ownership versus rental housing. And I ask, the reason I'm asking a question is because we hear a lot from the community about the types of housing that's going into Bothell is primarily attracting renters, when folks are interested in knowing, well, how could we help folks afford to own a home, have a family, do those types of things? Of course, you could do that in apartments as well. It reflects a certain value, right? But I'm trying to understand if there's a difference between the alternatives. Second piece of this, in terms of a difference between the alternatives, will one alternative potentially lead to more car traffic, those types of things, versus more public transit, or another one lead to more public transit use? Are there differences based on the choices here, centers versus neighborhoods?
Yeah, Kirsten, feel free to jump in if you want to, but the EIS will definitely look at all of that. We have a transportation section. There's actually a separate transportation consultant who's working on the element, and then also that section of the EIS. Traffic is always one piece of however you decide to direct growth. Traffic, there's impacts on traffic. Your other one with the Alt 2 may lead to more homeownership than rental housing. That may be a piece of this. We also will look at housing in the EIS, and so it'll evaluate each of the alternatives separately, also looking at maybe impacts that are common to all of the alternatives. So growth is going to happen under all. Some impacts are kind of will happen regardless, just because there is growth. And some of them you'll see potentially more, if you have more kind of townhomes or smaller housing types that are available for home ownership, versus if you're looking at mostly apartment buildings, that does have a difference in the opportunities that are available. So that would be part of the analysis as well. So that is like the kind of cost benefit comparison is part of the EIS, which we do in conjunction with the comp plan elements.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that we got to the maps we have now when it comes to transit, for example, we know that community transit, when they bring the Swift line online, they're planning to move their current route off of Bothell Everett Highway, either down, I think, 101st or 104th. So we know that central corridor of the city is going to have a transit route of some kind, probably a local access route. So we knew that that was going to make some sense. There's also parks along that corridor. There's also a couple schools. Then there's also a manufactured home park there as well. So that made a lot of sense in terms of looking at the high level. When it comes to, I think, thinking about transit in a more holistic way, we know that there's thresholds for when there's enough density to build a new line. I could imagine if we look at more of the neighborhood alternative, if there's more density throughout the city, maybe there might be more alternatives for transit. We're not sure. So I think the analysis component that we're working on through the EIS will help us think through some of that. So I think between the two alternatives, the overarching theme we kind of see, as I've talked through this with Jesse, is one's more of the kind of spread it out more evenly. One is more targeted towards existing corridors and centers. Both have, like you said, pluses and minuses. And I think that's some good feedback, that when we maybe take another look at this presentation for council, we can think about integrating some of that.
I appreciate, I think the public will want to know some of these things. And I realize you can't do the full analysis, but I think even high levels to start to think about, well, these are the things that might happen here or might happen here, or we're going to look here, we're going to look there. So I would encourage you to think about that in terms of the presentation to council.
Yeah, and the other piece that I wasn't able to get into the packet for today was the full list of the crosswalk between the land use designations and the zones. That's why I put as much as I could onto a slide, but I will be including that in the packet for council too. So it is there are 96, or not 96, 59. There's 59 zones. So, yeah.
Other commissioner questions, comments? Looking to our remote commissioners, anything from you folks? Commissioner Robson?
Thank you. I just have a couple of comments and questions. I am leaning towards the neighborhood alternative because I like the idea of more balanced growth as opposed to creating like like the other side of the tracks kind of feel. I feel like a more integrated population approach is good. One thing I'm wondering about, just as I look at the key here, is how, and maybe this is just totally out of left field, how are these plans different in meeting our employment targets? Will that make a difference as we shape density? Is there a difference between neighborhood alternatives? Do these maps address that at all?
So both of the action alternatives would be able to meet the employment targets. Some of that is around kind of assuming that you would be able to develop kind of Canyon Park at the more intensive employment uses that it's planned for. So some of it is kind of built into both of the alternatives. I will say in terms of the employment, there's not a huge difference in how they approach getting to those targets. It is very much in your kind of existing employment areas. There are some accommodations to allow kind of smaller scale neighborhood retail in some of the residential areas without spot designating those. So it would need to be within the regulations to allow that flexibility, because we don't want to like pinpoint a corner and say this is where a store is going to go in if somebody doesn't want to put a store on their home. But it is that would also be included in both of the alternatives. The focus is very much more on the difference in how they handle the housing target than the jobs target.
Thank you. Okay, that said, I am leaning more towards the neighborhood alternative, although I agree with Commissioner Jones that I would like to see more data about home ownership and traffic. I am leaning more towards the neighborhood alternative. Thank you.
Other commissioner comments? Commissioner Anders, Commissioner Westerbeck?
I have some, but I want to make sure Commissioner Anders does not.
No?
Okay.
All right, Commissioner Westerbeck?
Commissioner Westerbeck. I've got various comments. This is great stuff. I'm happy to see that we're going to a land use with zoning model. At first, it was someone who used the codes. It was a little confusing to me because I'm so used to them being locked together. But I like the fact that it allows this flexibility. I mean, for millennia, cities changed. Social, cultural, economic plagues, all kinds of things happen, and we have to sometimes be nimble if we're locked into really rigid zoning that doesn't allow some adaptation. It's to our detriment. I was happy to see that you quantified for us. We had created 18,205 jobs to 12,782 houses, or units, I guess. This seems like it's a chronic problem in Bothell. We are really good at, and I know what you said, we're behind on jobs even, but we seem to be really good at making jobs and not necessarily good at housing the people for those jobs. So they come in from Linwood and everywhere else, and which is fine, except that it creates a ton of traffic that we all hear about a lot. And we'll never be able to build enough roads, so huge fan of obviously protected bike lanes and transit and so forth. But just glad to see that we're going to try to create some more parity there between the two. I can't help but think, like, one of my visions for Bothell is that Snohomish County, we have the growth center up there, that we start to create kind of their version of our downtown here, a walkable, transit-rich, node like Urban 3 talked about, around the Fred Meyer or Canyon Park or Thrasher's Corner or something. But speaking of the alternatives, I'm kind of jumping around here. People were leaning towards the neighborhood. I like the neighborhood option a lot. Though the thing that concerns me about the number 3, the centers, is, there's a lot of focus, rightly so, on putting people who have to be in larger apartment buildings and stuff like that on arterials. We all know about the noise and the pollution and stuff, and we've got data on how more kids have asthma and everything else. We've already got that in Bothell. That's somewhat inevitable because that's often where the land is that you can do that with. But people who can't afford a more expensive place, they deserve to live on a quiet, leafy street too. And we've got a lot of those in Bothell that we're allowing people to finally, with HB 1110, build smaller multifamily on those. So one of the things that, to me, that goes along with that, which you just touched on, is re-legalizing the idea. Again, Urban 3 calls these little nodes, right? Commercial nodes. We had them everywhere 100 years ago. They're all over, dotting all over Seattle. Most of us travel to places where they've got all these wonderful little, Seattle calls them urban villages. So obviously, those have become problematic because we shoved all the commercial there, and then prevented single-family neighborhoods from doing their due to build multifamily and stuff like that. But I like the idea of spreading it around, and then I would love a mechanism for us in the future, Bothell, to say, like you said, we're not going to designate your corner as the place the store has to go, because then someone feels on the spot. But if someone wants to do the salon, the Yonder Cider, we all know about Yonder Cider in North Seattle, the corner store or whatever, allowing those. Spokane had a program where they started like 6 or 7 years ago, allowing people to re-legalize little commercial buildings that were sprinkled throughout their neighborhoods, and they were all made illegal. And so they have a program where you can re-legalize those, and so bakeries have gone in and coffee shops and stuff. I would love for us to allow that in Bothell, along with our middle housing and other initiatives. Like if someone wants to do, obviously not too bright with lights, not noxious, light commercial, certain things, quiet hours and stuff like that. But there's all kinds of stuff that's compatible with that, and that would also allow people to, provided someone felt like, building a little commercial zone over a couple decades. That gets them out of their car a little bit. They can e-bike, they can walk, they can use transit. They don't have to drive so much. So I just really think we need to allow the city, beyond our little commercial hubs right now, to adapt over time to what people want their city and their neighborhood to be. And we don't have that flexibility right now. Most of America doesn't. So let's do that. Let's start looking at what that would take. Again, Urban 3 called them nodes, I think, commercial nodes. And then, let me see. The ownership thing really struck too. So I think that's another thing where, we're starting to get there with the middle housing. Hopefully we'll get that passed maybe this fall, our more robust Bothell version. But, the more we can allow people to leverage their land to put more units on a piece of property, the more we're empowering people to build homes that can be sold for a lower price. I mean, it's just basic math, basic geometry. You can't get around geometry. So the more we can do that, and again, off of the main arterials and stuff, just, very egalitarian, let it happen all over the place. I think those are most of the points I wanted to make. I know I jumped all over the place, but just really being kind of getting out of the way a little bit and let people develop the city. I don't think we're going to be, I know this scares a lot of people. I hear it sometimes, but I don't think this is going to happen fast. Most people aren't going to turn their house into a bodega, but maybe a few will. Taco trucks in every corner, I'm all for that, but I know not everyone is, so a lot of people aren't going to do that, and it's not going to be comfortable. But I don't think we should be preventing people from doing that with certain guardrails. Thanks.
Thank you. Other commissioner comments? Just a few. Oh, Commissioner Gustafson, no, go right ahead.
I've already gone.
Okay. Okay. Few observations. Looking at the structures permitted versus housing units permitted is very interesting. How disproportionately high the number, well, I don't know if disproportionately, but how high the number of one-unit permits are, yet that's a really small percentage of the housing that's been provided. It's one thing that leaps out. The other thing that leaps out is we talked a lot about ADUs, and we've taken some actions permitting ADUs, and I don't see a skyrocketing of them in the past year or so. I mean, maybe early to see that, but as Commissioner Westerbeck said, permitting these things doesn't mean there'll be just a sudden flood of change. So it has been gradual, and I would expect that to continue. Question, you talk about emergency housing. How is that handled right now? Is there emergency housing provided in the city right now?
I'm going to probably have to get back to you on that question. I don't think so, as far as I know. And that's a little bit more of a question mark for me in terms of the guidance and what we need to show.
Yeah.
But I can get some information back to you on that.
I wasn't aware of any either. And it
I
seemed
know
like
we have provisions in the code for permitting temporary housing. I think that's required by law. But that is as much as I can speak to it now.
Okay. Because there is a need, and if you look even a little bit, you'll see some of the need on our streets. So I'd be interested in that.
Can I just add that I think we'll also look across the zones to make sure that it's not just being allowed in only one tiny little kind of space.
Okay, good. I think we do need to care for those folks and provide the capacity to care for those folks. Otherwise, I think it's good work. I think, as you indicated, it is early. There are questions, but that would be expected at this point in the process. So I think what we've seen is very interesting and promising. Do you need anything else from us?
If there's no other comments or questions, I think Tony has a question.
Yep, I see Commissioner Andrews now. Commissioner Andrews, please.
Hi. Commissioner Westerbeck made me think about a question I wanted to ask. Do we have any data on areas, towns of similar size to ours that made these sort of changes to let people develop their land as they see fit, and how quickly, your neighbors turn their house into a bodega? Do we have any data on that? It might, help people feel better to know that every neighbor is not going to start a business next door, but it's just an opportunity for people to develop their land and live the way that, works best for them. And that it's not really going to turn every residential area into a commercial center.
Yeah, I know there's a few jurisdictions throughout the country that have essentially, quote, removed single family housing from their regulations. So we can do some background information on that and pull maybe some of that for the council session. I think it's probably pretty early days for some of those. I know Minneapolis has and a couple other places. So that's really good feedback. I think we can pull together some information to provide at the council session.
Thank you.
I might be wrong, but didn't Spokane move on ADUs a number of years ago? Oh, not Spokane, Kirkland? Yeah, so it's not quite the same, but they...
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, because I have seen Adam Weinstein from Kirkland present on their ADU programs at the planning conferences in the past. I think similarly to us, it's been a little bit slow, mostly because it is quite costly. Yeah. ADUs, you have to still pay for most of the time the design. The construction can be really expensive. So any kind of programmatic approach to try and help folks do that is of a benefit. I know Seattle has a program called Seattle AD Universe where they have pre-approved plans that you can pay a small fee for, but that doesn't, again, get rid of permitting costs, construction costs. Jurisdictions like Oakland have actually set up programs to help with funding. I don't know that that's something that we're feasible to do at any time soon, but we have been speaking with, I can't remember who, but someone related to AD Universe about the pre-approved plans. So it is something we've been looking at with our building division as well. So that could be a program that we bring online at some point as well, just to at least make that component a little bit easier.
Thank you. I guess the point I was trying to raise in that is, though, it's a change that engendered a lot of concern about the amount of change that would happen. but where it's been done in other jurisdictions, it really hasn't been that dramatic, and
It's
it
been pretty
certainly hasn't
slow.
been quick.
Yeah, we haven't permitted a ton of ADUs. We've permitted some. And I know since we passed the duplexes on corner lots, it's been a while since I've been on current planning. I left last summer, but I can't think of any that we talked about or that came through, at least for that type, except potentially in some new subdivisions.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Westerbeck?
Just a quick comment. I don't really know if it applies, but in downtown Victoria, there's a very residential neighborhood. And I don't know if it's the False Bay neighborhood, but I could actually get it to, and I don't know again if it applies because it's been around for a long time, but they're very proud of their corner stores, and it's just integrated with housing all over, all different. It's kind of like our Lower Maywood, except more dense, but it's got single-family houses and apartments and condos, and some big and some small. And I was walking around there with someone who lives there last year, and he was saying, yeah, they're very proud of their corner stores because you've got them like every 5 or 10 blocks, but then it's primarily residential. And people have kind of kept these alive. But so again, that's kind of a grandfathered and old one, but I think that use is still allowed. So you do see some, boutique shops and stuff like that. But people just absolutely love them. It's part of what makes them proud of their neighborhood. So anyway, it's a cool little case study. And it, 50 years, maybe we could have that too.
All right, any closing comments from commissioners? Commissioner Gustafson?
Hi, Sarah Gustafson. I wanted to see if there's enough time to focus on the proposed alternative changes for Snohomish County. By the way, these maps are great. They're so colorful. They're great colors, and having alternatives really helps people make decisions. My question is, when I looked at the neighborhood alternative, for example, I didn't see a lot more density in Snohomish County, which I was curious about because it sounded like the greatest need was in Snohomish County. Am I not seeing the color change, or is there density already added in Canyon Park that I'm not picking up on?
There is some in the kind of, if you look in the center there, basically on either side of Red Barn for the most part. That is where a lot of it is, or the country village. We're working with the name for the sub area, but that's where a lot of it is focused. Okay. It would also be very much because there is a lot of kind of the residential low in Snohomish County. Some of the capacity is created there because of the HB 1110 and the increased density throughout, no matter where you are. Mm-hmm.
So that will be enough to boost it.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All that to say, that doesn't mean we can't do more if that's the direction you want to take.
Well, Jesse, thank you for that question. I would like to hear if other commissioners might have thoughts on that. I am from King County, and it would be good to hear from folks from Snohomish.
I might be the only Snohomish person here. And I'm up near Canyon Park Middle School, which is shown as residential medium. And my understanding is that under the increased density, there will be allowances for growth in that area, correct? Mm-hmm. And going with the neighborhood model, I think it would be more dispersed through there rather than, so we'd get more of the medium rather than more of the clusters. So I think that's what I'm taking from it. Is that more or less correct?
Yeah, the residential medium areas would see some more kind of the small scale multifamily. The residential low would just see kind of the slightly increased density, so the more units per lot. But it wouldn't be as much of a change as you might see in the residential medium areas. But that is the main difference between those two. In the neighborhoods in the residential medium, you'd probably see more of that smaller scale multifamily, or the kind of the middle housing essentially, and kind of infill. And then in the centers one, it would be more kind of it would still be somewhat dispersed because of the HB 1110 and 1337, but it would very much be more focused in along where the purple areas are.
So this is Commissioner Jones. Can you remind us of the process that will happen once after this goes to council? And then also, were there any alternatives that you discarded? And why?
I don't think we really discarded any alternatives. I think these kind of evolved from the discussions with staff. That's not to say, they're definitely not the only ways to go about this. And it may end up that there's some combination of these two, or especially when you get to kind of a preferred alternative later in the process. I can't think of any discarded alternatives that we came to. I don't think so. Yeah.
Yeah, and in terms of process, so the next step is to take it to council and get some feedback, and then to continue to refine it. And then ultimately, we'll end up with the evaluations of the alternatives to the EIS, and then come to a preferred alternative. And once we have a confirmed preferred alternative, then that's when we can start focusing on the actual regulation component to help implement the policy to get us to the targets. And so that's what the direction on sort of these two methodologies will help us with in terms of when we go to take a look at regulations. And that could be potential changes to the zoning map. It could mean more changes to the regulations themselves without a lot of changes to the zoning map. Just kind of depends where we end up with the preferred alternative.
And so I wanted to understand the process just a little bit better, because something Commissioner Westerberg said reminded me that I didn't necessarily give and I'm not suggesting that I can give a full list of sort of criteria for pros and cons, but I mentioned, and these are things that we've heard in terms of public statements, et cetera, right? Mm-hmm. So one is that ownership versus rental. One is certainly traffic, but I was actually also referring to, I think we need to think about climate impact, and I haven't done an environmental impact statement in a long time. Mm-hmm. So with SEPA, do they look at climate impact and do they look at environmental justice? Because I think that's what Commissioner Westerberg was referring to.
Sorry, I tried to jump in too soon. Yes, so environmental justice is a required component of the land use element, and then also kind of how we look at land use in the EIS now. Climate is built in the EIS. We're not doing it as a separate section, but it is kind of built in the chapters. So there are climate related kind of metrics or thresholds that we'll look at across the sections. It's being built in very much in the same way that we are trying to with equity, where we will set up that framework and then it will be across all of the different EIS sections.
And so just one last piece of this, and it's more so that I understand the process when I'm asked about it. But so after council, as you said, it will go through the environmental impact assessment, and then we'll come up with a preferred alternative. When does that go back to council or come back to us, or does it?
When does the preferred alternative come back to you? So that's part of after the draft EIS is released, which we're aiming for the end of February right now. There's kind of the public process with that, and then we work to develop a preferred alternative based on that and get feedback from Planning Commission and Council to get direction on what that preferred alternative is before we then take it back into the final EIS to reevaluate the preferred alternative impacts, kind of, and where they fall within the other alternatives.
Mm-hmm. So to restate what I think I heard you say, there would not be a preferred alternative in the draft, but the final would. Well, I've seen it done both ways. So.
Yeah, we do not, that is not how we do it.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, no preferred alternative in the draft. We wait until we've gotten comments from both the public and other agencies, council, everyone.
Sure, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And we will also have these maps at the open house in October for the public to review and comment on as well. Yeah.
So how did you determine the residential medium versus residential low? And I'm looking, right in the middle where we talked on 100th Avenue. One side is medium, one side is low. That's actually one of my walking routes, and it's hard to tell the difference from one side of the street to the other.
I believe we assumed, I'm sorry, I can't remember the 104th. I think that is where we were looking at the transit line being, and we kind of went to the next major street to the east and west.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that it couldn't extend further, especially to the west as you move towards the mixed use. It might not make sense to have a residential low pocket there, but there is, I know there's the manufactured housing park
Yes.
there, and I can't remember exactly where the boundary of that is within that residential, or I guess that is shown on that is designated
yes, it is.
itself, yeah.
Brown, yeah.
So it may not make sense to keep that residential low there. I have to check with my colleague who helped develop the map if there was a specific reason why that was left.
Yeah, I think I can speak to that a little bit.
Okay.
The areas of residential low on the backside of the eastern purple portions of Bothell Highway, there's some really challenging topography there, so it really drops off down into where Lake Pleasant is. So in terms of a potential connection to the purple, it's a little deceptive on the map where you can't see the topography that might be kind of a transition zone just by fact of it is a really steep slope right there. That's pretty wooded. So there's not as much of a physical relationship between those spaces as might appear on the map.
Yeah, they certainly are separate.
Yeah.
Commissioner Gustafson?
Hi, Sarah Gustafson here. I'd like to bring up a question that Vice Chair Kurd first asked, which is there are several different designations within downtown. Does it make sense to have 5 different designations for downtown? Can any be consolidated? What are the pros and cons of that? Thanks.
We've talked a little bit about that, and I think that's still kind of up for discussion. One of the concerns was just wanting to make sure we weren't reopening or relitigating the downtown sub-area plan as part of this process. So wanting to respect, that did go through a very lengthy public engagement process to get to where it is. And I know that there's been some discussion about a potential relook at the plan. Now it's been there for a while, is there an opportunity to relook at some things? So it's possible that when we do that, there might be an opportunity, I think, to have some more consolidated choices potentially while looking at the plan. But we have had discussions about that, so that could be an ongoing thing to discuss internally. Yeah.
All right. Any other comments? Looking to our Zoom participants and around the table. Commissioner Gustafson.
Hi, Sarah Gustafson here. Just to recapitulate Commissioner Jones' criteria and add a few more. Ownership, traffic, climate impact, environmental justice. I think we discussed transit opportunities. Perhaps those would be more present in a central alternative. And then also, this is really difficult to determine, but gentrification or displacement impacts. Thank you. Any other?
And I know we received a number of written comments prior to this meeting, more or less leveraging off of that. This map is not intended to show buffers or green belts or sensitive areas. I mean, nor, maybe flipping that on its head, nor would this map supersede those where there are sensitive areas. Just because this map shows something, it would not remove that sensitive designation, correct?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Just wanted to be sure we had that on the record. All right. Any more? I know we've pondered this a little bit, and we will be seeing this again, correct? All right, well, thank you then. Thank you for your presentation. It's very informative. Thank you for coming here tonight.
Thanks.
With that, I think we'd close the study session and move on our agenda The next item is reports from staff. Do we have reports from staff this evening?
We do not.
Do not. All right. Reports from members. Members like to share anything with the group? Seeing none. Oh,
Hi,
Mr. Gustafson.
Sarah Gustafson here. I was wondering if we could get a quick update, overview of Planning Commission items that have gone before council, the DeTahoe and other comprehensive plan updates. What is the? Yeah.
I can provide a brief update. The downtown transition affordable housing overlay, DeTahoe. I love saying DeTahoe. That had been scheduled initially for a study session before the city council last week. Staff, after reviewing our code in further detail, determined that a step had not yet been taken when it came to evaluating the request. And it's really a concurrency evaluation that needs to happen to assess impacts of traffic on our roadways that would result from the rezoning, specifically the Drew's request. And so that process is ongoing now. I just will chalk it up to a miscommunication. It's not on the applicant. They are now moving forward to prepare that analysis. When staff does receive their report, we do a peer review, and that will factor into our recommendation to city council. We will likely need to come back to planning commission to make sure you're aware of what that analysis has. And that might be October 18th. I believe that's a scheduled meeting for planning commission. It really just depends on the timing. Once that is complete, it will be ready to go to a study session before city council, and that's likely going to happen November. Again, it really does depend on timing. Now regarding the comprehensive plan amendments that are associated with that, those would also move forward afterwards. And those are really paired with the decisions that city council would need to make when it comes to the recommendations on middle housing, the comp plan amendments in particular. And those really need to be made in conjunction with each other. When city council makes a decision about comp plan amendments on their annual docket, they need to be made together in unison, even though the issues aren't always related to each other. So middle housing, that decision is not really going to be on the city council's agenda until we're able to resolve the DeTahoe matter and get that scheduled for study session. So it's still very much on staff's radar to move that forward. But procedurally, we're really looking at later this year for it to be considered at city council. In terms of comp plan amendments in the docket, there will be code amendments ready to move forward depending on the feelings of city council members. That's the update that I have at this stage. I'm happy to return next month as well to give you an update.
Just to clarify, you explained some things I was going to ask about too. Is my understanding, like you couldn't vote on the DeTahoe and the missing middle that we passed to council almost a year ago separately. They had to be included, right? Kind of get one chance at cracking it open per year,
Yeah.
correct? When as long as you're not doing the comp plan update. So we think that they might actually try to, as long as they can, staff can schedule that study session and I guess public hearings and so forth, we might see that vote on those two items before the end of 2023?
That is possible, yes. And that is staff's goal, to be able to move forward on the analysis and work with the applicant for DeTahoe so that we at least have that resolved, study session, and then the comp plan amendments, the docket for 2023 could be fully considered by city council with those two items together.
Because if it trickles in or, folds into 24, does that mean we then have only one chance also in 2024? We miss the 2023 opportunity?
Well, it's an
Or is it
interesting
because
question.
it's a comp plan year?
Yeah,
that we
it
get
doesn't
to do a bunch at once.
There isn't necessarily a clock ticking in terms of like the 12 months. We could technically extend into the following year. The goal is for that not necessarily to occur with the comp plan amendments. However, with the overall comp plan update that we're doing right now, I don't know that there will be a 2024 docket.
Okay.
That's not to say that we won't receive applications or requests for
Right.
either rezonings or comp plan amendments between now and the end of October, which is the deadline.
Always do.
But my hope is that if we do receive those, we'll be able to fold those into this larger effort that's ongoing right now, because there's still time to do that.
Right, and because just for my edification, we're allowed to do multiple at once for that once every 10-year comp plan update, correct?
Yes.
It's not just the one, because it's sort of the in between the 10 years, we're only allowed to do one every 12 months, basically.
Yeah.
We have to cluster them, okay. So we kind of have one opportunity every 10 years to do many at once, because we're updating everything.
Exactly.
Okay, just want to make sure I'm clear, because I'm sometimes confused.
Well, this is a confusing time as well in terms of how to address requests from the public for changes to the
Yeah.
comp plan.
Yeah,
When we have a 2015 comp plan, we're like, well, we're already updating it. So really, it's better to fold it into the overall
Yeah.
process that we're going through right now. And again, based on our deadline for receiving requests, there's still time to do that.
yeah, a lot. And to that point about the 2015, we've obviously in the letters today and letters recently, we've received some pushback about we're not following the 2015. It does seem like we're in sort of a transition zone where we're still, of course, under the 2015, but at the same time, because of HB 1110 and 1220 and 1337, all these others, we absolutely have to be changing things and moving towards this, update. And so, I don't know, I guess I'm just bringing it up in case someone's watching. We are required to update it. And, correct me if I'm wrong, so we are doing what we're supposed to be doing as far as integrating new ideas and adapting to legislation and growth targets and things like that.
That's true. And as Jesse explained, the alternatives both really do consider HB 1110, for example, in slightly different ways, but it does consider it. And so that requirement from the state is going to be reflected in an updated land use plan.
Yeah, okay. And we're planning for that now, so we have to talk about it at some point because it takes a while. Okay, thanks.
Okay, any other reports or questions from members? Looking across and seeing none. I don't believe we have anything to report to council out of this meeting. So there being no further business, is there a motion to adjourn? Commissioner Jones?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I will second that. Thank you, Sarah Gustafson.
All in favor of adjourning the meeting?
Aye.
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 We have unanimous consent there. Therefore, the meeting of the September 20th meeting of the Planning Commission is adjourned at 7:28. Our next meeting will be October 4th. Thank you all for participating.
Thank
Bye,
you.
folks.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye.